Good evening. Good evening. Thank you all for coming. It is always wonderful to see a very full room, especially this time of year, so thanks. My name is Peter Christian Niger. I'm the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History, and it's my pleasure to welcome our guest tonight on this topic. It's a little strange to be introducing this topic given that it's the first, we were just talking about, this is the first book on the subject. We associate New York City, of course, with the architecturally modern, perhaps quintessentially the skyscraper in which we're standing in the shadow of here in the skyscraper room. Just up the street, however, you go to the New York Public Library, and it's one of many famous examples we could think of the imposing legacy of ancient Greece and Rome in terms of New York City's architecture, and behind that, of course, Egypt. Here in Gotham, the city that gave birth to modernism. Behind that story, apparently, was of course, a neoclassicism that was born in Britain, France, and Germany at the turn of the last century. We learn in this new book, copies of which are on sale, a discount at the door, with New York City once again playing that part of transatlantic intermediary that it has so often played in our history. It is surprising to learn, as the editors of this volume inform me, of course, that this is the first book on the reception of classical architecture in New York City in this time period, but apparently that is true, and so that was reason enough to have them in here for a conversation, and I'm delighted to do that. I'm so happy that you all could join us. I'm going to introduce the speakers and then get off stage so that we can have the conversation. Conversation will go till about 7:15 or so, and then we will have 20 to 30 minutes of Q&A from you, and then conclude at 7:45 so that you can all go out and get your dinners. So first, we have Elizabeth Macaulay-Lewis, an archaeologist and architectural historian here at the Graduate Center, whose research focuses on the material culture of the Roman, late antique, and Islamic worlds, with particular emphasis on Roman gardens and architecture, the reception of ancient material culture in the United States, and Islamic architecture. Elizabeth is assistant professor in the liberal studies program here, where she also serves as the acting executive officers for the master's program and directs its concentration in the archaeology of the classical, late antique, and Islamic worlds. She served as deputy director of Manar al-Attar, did I pronounce that correctly? Yeah. An open access digital humanities resource for the study of the Middle East, and is currently the chairperson of the Smart Histories Governing Board, as well as contributing editor for Art of the Islamic World. Matthew McGowan is associate professor of classics at Fordham University, where he teaches a wide range of courses from classical myth and advanced Greek to Roman elegy and Latin prose composition. His interests have focused on Latin literature, ancient scholarship, and the classical tradition, publishing research on a range of authors and topics from Virgil and Ovid to Renaissance Latin and teaching the classics. His first book, Ovid in Exile, Power and Poetic Redress in the Tristia and Epistulae ex Ponto, appeared in 2009. He's recently begun work on a book-length survey of the history of Latin lexicography, or the art of dictionary writing in ancient Rome, and now serves as president of the New York Classical Club, an organization created in 1900, whose ongoing mission is to promote the study of classical antiquity in the New York metropolitan area. And then finally, we have our moderator and discussant for the evening, Molly Heintz, who is chair of design research at the School of Visual Arts Master's Program and editor-in-chief of Oculus, the quarterly magazine of the American Institute of Architects, New York chapter. She is a founding partner of the design consultancy Superscript and has served as that firm's managing director since 2012, where she's collaborated on projects for a range of design organizations and institutions, including the MoMA and Rockwell Group, and where she also produced a conversation series for the Museum of Arts and Design and produced a for the Arts and Design, the Venice Architectural Biennale, and the Oslo Architecture Triennial. Before that, Molly led communications departments at the architecture firms Gensler and Rockwell Group and was a fellow at the Philip Johnson Glass House, where she helped launch the interactive site Glass House Conversations. She holds BAs in Classics and Archaeology from Duke University, an MFA in Design Criticism from the School of Visual Arts, and an MA in the History of Art and Architecture from Harvard University, where her research focused on narratives attached to design objects. She's edited several books and magazines, is a contributor to various magazines, is published as well in widely. That research focuses on design and disinformation, and she has recently begun a project on design and disinformation, presenting at a recent conference on the role of design in the creation of fake news. So even here, apparently, we can't get away from Trump. Would you all please join me in welcoming our guests tonight?
Okay, well, thank you, Peter, for the intros. And I just myself walked down here from Rockefeller Center, which is featured on the cover of your book. And also, it's effectively where the book ends chronologically, right? In that most of the projects discussed fall in the 19th and early 20th century. So to begin, I'm going to immediately pass the baton to you two so that you can give us a bit of background on the project of the book and how it started, how it's delimited, how you call it a selective survey. So I'd like you to describe what that means. And also, if you could talk about perhaps the setting for the monuments and the subject matter in the book, in that how would you characterize New York City during that period, and for that matter, the United States? So, Elizabeth, you're driving a slideshow, so I know you have you both have some slides prepared, so.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Those are kind of a great set of questions to start off with. And yeah, the period that you kind of allude to, that we're looking predominantly but not entirely towards the second half of the 19th century and all the way up to Rockefeller Center, which is effectively, largely completed by around the early 1940s. That's right. I mean, that is kind of the golden era, but it starts much earlier than that. It starts with Federal Hall, which is one of the case studies in the book as well. But maybe one of the reasons why I want to maybe take us into a specific monument, which is kind of how certainly I came to the project, and then Matt can also speak to how he came to the project, because neither one of us started as New York. I mean, we're kind of New York people in a certain sense. We have long histories with the city, but we didn't necessarily, as people who engaged with the classical world, immediately go, ooh, New York, that's got to be a nexus for our research. But I think both of us had experiences being in the city and engaging with the art and architecture and the inscriptions, the kind of words all around us. That meant that we got very interested and engaged with New York and its kind of appropriation and engagement with the classical past. One thing that's always important to know is that at the beginning part of the Republic, almost everybody's education had some component of classics in it, and that's something that we don't always remember. For example, George Washington, when he was on campaign during the Revolutionary War, he showed his troops a play about Cincinnatus, who was this famed Roman farmer who then became a general, a la George Washington, and then went back to being a farmer. So kind of this way that new Americans could envision themselves. So it's kind of the background and history of, in certain senses, the world of classics. For me, this was again a kind of, it was accidental, like many things in one's academic careers. I was walking, oh, there we go, it worked, brilliant. I was out walking. I just moved back from many years living in the UK, and I was very confused as I was walking up. Actually, I was in Central Park, and I got a glimpse of the Central Park West facade of the American Museum of Natural History. I was terribly confused, actually, because to me, it was obviously the Arch of Constantine, but someone had stuck it on top of, had stuck it literally to a very decent Romanesque building, a building actually that Lewis Mumford, famous architectural historian, loved in terms of it as a great Romanesque building, and he was really upset that in fact somebody had gone and put something classical on it. But to me it was so striking. Why had the state of New York decided that this should be its memorial to Teddy Roosevelt? As you can see in the inscription that's up there, it's very clear that this is a way to commemorate a man who is considered to be one of the great sons of New York. This project started started in the 1920s. You know, I think he died in 1919, so it was immediately deemed to be an appropriate form, and we can see things that were really relevant to his life. We can see Audubon, Boone, Lewis, and Clark, you know, there. And so I was just so struck by it. And also, of course, there's this statue, which is now somewhat controversial, in front of it. But to me, it was just this interesting way to start to see. And then everywhere I started to look, there were more and more buildings. Also, if you go inside, many of you know this, it's usually crowded with small children. But if you ever have a chance to go in and look, you can see that, again, it's this big bath building that's been used. And so for me, it set off this whole line of inquiry of trying to find these buildings everywhere. And what was striking to me was that they weren't just to be found in Manhattan in kind of points that we think of prime real estate, but probably my favorite building, and the building that I talk about in the book, is the, oops, let's see if it let me go forward, yeah, to the Gould Memorial Library. How many people have ever been to this building? Oh, nice. We got real New Yorkers. You guys rule, okay. Okay, you guys are much better traveled New Yorkers than most people I meet. Well, yes, you should go inside the library. The inside of the library, wait a minute, Will, because you're gonna beat me to my punchline if I don't get there quickly. Hang on one sec, because you have to see the inside of the library. Oh, sorry, I have a whole narrative, but I feel like it's not fair if you've never seen it. You've got to, it's just spectacular. This is the interior of the library. So this is one of Stanford White's buildings that not everybody knows. It also actually serves as the memorial to Stanford White. The bronze doors that you go in were erected by his friends and family and designed by his son. As you all know, he was murdered, and so this was a commemorative building to him and also to Jay Gould, the very famous financier. But it was also this kind of building that was designed to anchor New York University's new campus that was going to be uptown in the Bronx in University Heights. And so there was this big shift northwards. And what was just kind of interesting to me is that people were looking to these buildings for all different types of architecture, and whether it was museums, whether it was Rockefeller Center looking in terms of the art and architecture, or libraries, it was absolutely everywhere. And so, you know, part of me coming to the architecture, then Matt and I ran into each other, we're talking about these things, and what was interesting in talking to Matt about it was that, in fact, this was also something happening in language and in buildings, and this other medium that we don't always take for granted. So maybe, I don't know, Matt, if you want to say some things about the words, I can give you.
Yeah, I think that that's a good place to transition, because this is the title of my piece in the volume. And by the way, let me just say, since I've started speaking, thank you for the invitation. And thank you to Peter in particular for that introduction. I should say that it's a delight to be here at the Gotham Center because, you know, Gotham is in our title. Discovering Greece and Rome and Gotham. And we could say a lot about the origin of that word. I am, after all, as Peter mentioned, a lexicographer, and I can hardly help myself. But since we're on the clock, let me just say that when I was in graduate school at New York University in the late 90s and early aughts, I had a little tour of downtown Manhattan, which I called Latin in Manhattan. And I used to take my students around, starting in Washington Square Park, and go down to Battery Park City, reading all the inscriptions that I could find. And over the course of my graduate career, I had collected a good many. And that, in fact, is the origin of my interest in the inscriptions in New York. But this project and some other projects that I also have in the work, one of which, by the way, is a guidebook to the Greek and Latin inscriptions of New York City, in fact, of Manhattan. So that, too, we have in the works with Fordham University Press, and when that comes out, we'll get another discussion going. But in any case, I was always interested in what I call the classical encounter, which is the either purposeful or just serendipitous meeting of the classical world, or influence of Greece and Rome, which literally surrounds us as we move through our daily lives in New York City. And it's obvious if you're reading Latin and Greek inscriptions, but it's also obvious if you're looking at the sort of formal qualities of the buildings, the monuments, even the kind of appeal to classical culture, if not in form, then at least in idea, that we see so often. And I think that Lizzie has ably demonstrated in the Roosevelt Memorial there at the American Museum. But so I think how we react to that encounter says a lot about our experience of New York City and indeed of the world in which we live. My reaction is to engage, to converse. And I'm just delighted by the setting of this event here as a conversation. Because as you can see, I think conversation and dialogue is really at the heart of how we interact with the classical world and indeed receive the classical world. And I think there are varying registers, different timbers of that conversation, sometimes loud and unavoidable, other times much more muted and perhaps hard to hear, but ever present and ongoing, I would say. And in that sense, I think there are two basic ways in which architects, artists, indeed people writing inscriptions have chosen to interact with the classical past. And one of them is to appeal to the permanence of the classical world. And indeed, I take my title from a quotation from Samuel Johnson. And if I know how to work this thing, I suppose this arrow means go forward. Look, there it is. So Samuel Johnson in Boswell's glorious Life of Johnson is reputed to have said in response to why he had composed the epitaph in Westminster Abbey for the Irish polymath and poet Oliver Goldsmith in Latin and not in English, this, namely, the language of the country of which a learned man was a native is not the language fit for his epitaph, which should be in ancient and permanent language. Everything, says Johnson, intended to be universal and permanent should be in Latin. And I think that, there may be some hope that that is true on the part of some people still using Latin. I think today it's a far cry from our experience of the language, which is barely studied anymore, let alone read. And so I think that there's in fact another way in which we encounter the classical past. And let me see what I have up here. That's another monument. But I think that, and I'll just go to it because eventually we'll talk about it. And how many hundreds of slides do we have up here, Lizzie?
I've used all of the slides you sent me, Matt. He likes his words. I wanted to make sure that you had all of them available.
Very good. Look at all these words. Anyway, we'll come back. There it was. Look, this is from 2002, and some of you might know it from the F and D train there at 42nd Street and 6th Avenue under Bryant Park by Brooklyn-based artist Samm Kunce, whose mosaic here quotes the poet not of permanence but of change, Ovid, and his Metamorphoses, and suggests that the changing shape of the city, even its underground world, can receive some inspiration from the classical past. And so this slide and this whole artwork is to show that this conversation is still ongoing. And I think I might stop there, lest I hog all our time and we get actually a chance to talk. So thank you.
Let's talk. Thank you both. And that's a perfect segue, because I wanted to really kind of underscored that key theme of the book, which is that these elements of architecture and text are not simply representing the past, that is, the past in the form of both ancient sources and more recent interest in the Greek and Roman style, but that the buildings and monuments and inscriptions continue to have a vibrant life on their own, with meaning continuously layered onto them from generation to generation. And as symbols, they invite the contemporary public to engage with them. And one very recent example of this, not in New York, but in Paris, was the Arc de Triomphe, which I'm sure some of you saw in the news recently, was vandalized with graffiti in the midst of protest in the city by a group calling themselves the Yellow Vests, and it got tagged with multicolored graffiti. And I want to come back to the topic of a triumphal arch in a minute because we have a lot to talk about there. But first, I really want to talk a little bit more about this idea of a dialogue with these monuments, which can often be that kind of intense conversation. And to frame up this idea in the book, you invoke the scholar Shane Butler and his idea or concept of so-called deep classics. And I was wondering if you could elaborate here on that idea of deep classics and what it means in the context of your book.
Do you want to go first with layering? Or
Sure, or unless you want to talk about
responses to buildings?
Yeah.
I'll start with the buildings and then we can talk
Okay.
about Shane. So I think that the phenomenon that you describe at the Arc de Triomphe is actually one that we've been seeing before. It's one that started, certainly in the United States, in a sense, with the Confederacy monuments. And what's interesting is that we've had some of those reverberations in New York City, even if they haven't been that well reported in the press, but they pop up if you're looking for them. And so actually this is where, for me, the thing that's interesting about the Gould Memorial Library, and one of the reasons why I was attracted to it as a building, and I'm going to go back for a second, is not so much the Gould Memorial Library, which everyone agrees is this fabulous building that needs to be renovated desperately and needs a lot of money and support. You know, it was in The Greatest Showman, so, you know, it always helps when Hollywood takes an interest, but they don't necessarily provide that much funding. But the thing that I find very interesting, when we get all the way back, sorry, we always have too many slides, it's a problem as architectural historians, which for me is actually the Hall of Fame, which is the Hall of Fame of Great Americans, which runs around, it's this kind of massive portico behind here. You can see it. So if you ever are over in Upper Manhattan, you can look over and see it. What was interesting is that this was designed as a kind of portico in the great kind of hall traditions of the 18th and 19th century of these German halls and also Westminster Abbey of kind of notables being celebrated. And so here, there was a group of electors who you could basically say, my candidate is a great American and you should vote for him and put a statue up. And so there are a large number of busts, two of whom were of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, which may be surprising to people in New York City. And those were removed earlier this year by Governor Cuomo. He said, I'm taking them, I'm moving them. I'm not telling you where they are. Somewhat very Cuomo-esque. So that said, but what I thought was interesting was that was a missed opportunity for a conversation because Jackie Robinson is also here, and so is George Washington Carver. It has got to be striking that a group of different electors who changed over a period of time, but not that much, would elect both of those people, or there would have been campaigns to kind of put those two groups of people in the same monument. That is a conversation we need to be having about what our monuments represent, what our history represents, why we value the people we value. And so what's interesting and what is starting to happen actually with different colleagues up at Bronx Community College, there's a whole group working on the Hall of Fame and the archives, is to actually trying to figure out how we have these difficult conversations. Because even before this, you know, a couple of years ago, the New York Times was running articles about how this Hall of Fame has no connection really to the current students there. They don't know who these people are. They feel feel disconnected. They don't necessarily see people who reflect their own, racial, religious, or ethnic identity or experience. And so for me, with this point of dialogue and thinking about things, these are buildings that maybe could help us understand and have conversations we need to have as a country. So there's this layering, which then I think also leans nicely into this idea of deep classics.
Yeah, definitely. What Shane Butler, who's professor of classics at Johns Hopkins University, has given us is a very sophisticated way of understanding what classical reception means over against, say, past appeals to a kind of ongoing tradition, a direct legacy, if you will, of having, say, Athens transported directly to New York, or Rome transported directly to Manhattan, say, in the form of the main building of the New York Public Library. That, in fact, there is not necessarily a one-to-one transfer. There is a lot that has to happen in between. And he introduces a model from geology, namely stratigraphy. Is that what I'm, yeah, stratigraphical. I can do the adjective better. The stratigraphical reading of the monument actually brings us to what's underneath, which are the remains of the end of the Croton Reservoir, which was itself an Egyptian.
I'll go find it.
You actually have it?
Of course.
Oh.
I couldn't resist it. It'll take me an eternity.
Anyway, if you go into the basement of the New York Public Library, you can still find the remains of this Egyptian-style reservoir building that actually stood for nearly 60 years on that spot before Imperial Rome took up residence in this 4 square block. There it is. And so what Shane has given us is this penchant to look beneath the surface and to find out the different layers underneath. And this is a very good example, which we open our book with.
Great. And in addition to the Hall of Fame conversation, that is one that we should be having. There was also a conversation of sorts in the late 60s in the Gould Library when there was vandalism that happened there.
Oh,
correct?
yes. No, it was firebombed.
Firebombed.
Someone threw a Molotov cocktail in the lower hall, in the lower basement of it. During protests, there had been, I think, one or two professors of Africana Studies who had been unsummarily fired. And so that was the building that was kind of attacked, because these buildings are sometimes seen, and in many ways rightfully so, but not always, as symbols of authority, patriarchy, of the establishment. And there was definitely that phase throughout large portions of the 20th century where they came to symbolize kind of these negative things. I do think that tide is slightly turning on that in certain ways, because I think in whatever chaos of the world that we have today, sometimes there is an appreciation of things that are aesthetically pleasing. I think people are happy when they go to Grand Central Terminal because it's nice, versus if they go to Penn Station, where it's miserable. And I know Lydia, who's one of my students, is here, and she has to go out of Penn Station. So I feel your pain in about 20 minutes. And also I have to go out of it on Friday. But I think what's also interesting is that while there was this kind of rejection of many of these forms, or that progress was more important, so the destruction of the old Penn Station, it's interesting to me that with the kind of work that's going on at Penn Station right now, that they're going to take the Farley Post Office and turn it into the new Amtrak Center. And so there's something interesting about going back to a building, giving it an afterlife, and deciding that actually people want to be in a nice space, in an interior space that works well. Makes everybody much happier. So that to me is interesting, again, of this layering, that buildings have kind of times where they're successful or they're popular and then not so popular, but we somehow coming back to classical architecture again and again, because it seems to have worked very well, and at some level it's aesthetically pleasing.
Yeah, that reminds me of a quote. I think the person was unidentified, but it was a user of Grand Central Station who was just saying that actually using that space on a day-to-day basis made you feel like you were doing something important, essentially. Processing through that space gave whatever you were doing significance. So Matt, there's a story that you have as part of, I think, is it in your essay, the New York Academy of Medicine inscription story, and that's a different kind of conversation that I thought was also an interesting one. If you could maybe tell that.
Yeah, some of you might know the New York Academy of Medicine up on Fifth Avenue and 103rd Street, which is 1929. York and Sawyer are the architects, and is a strange building. And I don't know if we have a shot of the whole, probably not, just the inscriptions. Oh well, I am a lexicographer, but anyway, it's this strange pastiche of classical, medieval, and Byzantine architectural forms. But there are no fewer than 18 Latin inscriptions, which may make it the most Latin building. Oh, there it is. There's the whole. Yeah.
Apologies.
In the city. 26 rather than 29. But anyway, the president of the New York Academy of Medicine at the time was a classicist Monkey, and was keen to bestow upon the building, as I think had been the case for the Academy itself, a kind of aura of the classical, and indeed a link to the classical past in the arts and in science. And so the building is covered with inscriptions from Cicero, from Juvenal, from Horace, from the real classics of Latin literature, with statements about the importance of medicine and taking care of others. However, when it came to the actual title, and I wonder if we have this, oh, it must be in this way. Here he is, that's Charles Loomis Dana, and his archive is up at the Academy, and it's just fascinating to read because you see him struggling with different quotations and trying some out. And anyway, when it came to actually saying the New York Academy of Medicine in Latin, they had some difficulty. And so they came up with this Academy Medicinae Nova Iberacensis, which is to say the new Academy of Medicine at York, and not the New York Academy of Medicine. You just can't get around it. For they had asked for some help from Princeton professor, Dr. Andrew West, who came up with this. And scholars, classicists in particular in New York, were utterly scandalized. And I have an account in the article about their letters back and forth. It was, the World's Fair was coming, and they were embarrassed to be receiving Europeans who would know better. They knew perfectly well that average New Yorkers wouldn't know what the Latin said, and they didn't have to worry about them. But the Europeans coming for the fair, can you imagine? Let's change the inscription. But as always is the case in these things, it came down to money, and they decided not to change it, saying, this was in the 30s, the current president who made the president at the time who made the decision, that, well, I trust that most people walking by will not know the difference. But I submit, we know the difference. We're not as much bothered by it as amused. And it's a very interesting point about the legacy of Latin and its inherent difficulty.
Yeah. Before we move on, I just wanted to note that this book actually started itself as really a conversation and a conference, right?
Yes.
Papers delivered. Can you talk a little bit about just the genesis of the book?
Well, Matt, when he was president of the New York Classical Club, kind of thought that getting a bunch of us together who were interested in these ideas would be really fun. I mean, what better than to get together with a bunch of other classicists, classical archaeologists, and art historians and talk for a whole day. It's kind of for us heaven. So it was really an interesting thing. It was down at NYU, and it was sponsored by the New York Classical Club, which is is it the kind of oldest organization that's outside of universities that supports classics in New
city.
York?
Oh, yeah, ongoing, yeah.
And so we all got together, and it was really just interesting because there were people who were historians, who were philologists, art historians, archaeologists, all working on it together. So it also reminds us that when we want to do interesting work or interdisciplinary work, one needs to have people from other backgrounds and conversations. So like Francis Moroney, who's one of our contributors, he is such a New York guy. And so for him to kind of bring a really informed knowledge of New York history kind of in a sense helps all of us who come from a classical perspective to do a better job on knowing our New York stuff, where we can bring a knowledge of the classical world that kind of works with him and complements things. So that was the genesis for it. And then we just kind of kept finding interesting contributors who could make the volume even richer.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I wanted to talk about not the 30s World's Fair, but go back to the 1893 Chicago World's Fair and talk a little bit about influences around the classics and popular culture around that time, of which the Columbian Exposition certainly was one, and McKim, Mead, and White were involved in that. But certainly the Beaux-Arts style in architecture had been de rigueur for some time at that point. But what do you think in terms of a more popular understanding of classical forms was propagated by the Chicago World's Fair?
I would say it even starts a little bit before then. And I think we can find that in some of the temporary arches. There are also popular entertainments. If you went to Coney Island, there were regular displays of the destruction of Pompeii with Vesuvius exploding at night, which was very popular. There were also plays. I mean, one of the most successful books in the 19th century was The Last Days of Pompeii, which was a novel written in 1834, and it was widely translated. But it also was like a stage performance, and so people would go and watch that. So there are these kind of multiple different levels, but one thing people would see would be these big parades, which definitely, I'm going to go forward, have their kind of original genesis in the triumphal processions of antiquity. So in antiquity, if you were a successful general, sorry, I'm just going to bounce forward, and then we'll get there we go. We'll start with temporary and permanent arches. One of the things in antiquity would be these monumental processions that would go through the city of Rome along the Triumphal Way and culminate in the Roman Forum and then on the Capitoline Hill with a sacrifice and kind of parading all of the slaves, captives, and booties that you've kind of taken back on your conquest. It was a way of actually kind of, there was no Twitter, there was no social media, there was no video cameras. So if you're you've conquered a distant land, you have to really represent that in a procession that you then would kind of make permanent through a monument where you would represent battles and achievements in stone. And so kind of leading up to the Chicago's World Fair and also in the whole period of the late 1880s and 1890s, New Yorkers really embraced this idea of parades and spectacle. And one of the ways that they did that was connected to George Washington's, the centennial anniversary of George Washington's inauguration in 1889. And so here are two of the temporary arches that were erected to him. The one that is to your left, which I think is super hokey and kind of funny looking, which is the medieval style arch. That was at Madison Square Park. And the other arch, which is in Harper's engraving, was right just north of Washington Square Park. And that one was very successful and very well received. It was made of staff, which is kind of the plaster, which was this kind of plaster work that was used for a lot of the World's Fair. And what was interesting is New Yorkers liked it so much that after the procession and this big celebration had happened, people were taking parts of it off to take home as their mementos. But with that came this real desire to kind of make this a more permanent monument. And so that is how we got basically, I'll get there, to the Washington square arch, which you can see here. But what's also interesting, going back, is that this sets off a whole kind of creation of temporary arches. The next most important kind of event was in 1892. You know, New York didn't get the World's Fair. They lost out to Chicago. But that did not stop them from having this kind of monumental kind of 3 or 4 days of celebrations to celebrate the 400th anniversary. And I think the thing that's always interesting to point out is at that moment in time, Columbus was revered. Everybody wanted a piece of Columbus. And so what's interesting is that if you look at the history and the different people who start to erect monuments to Columbus, it is everybody. The Spanish are erecting statues, the Germans are erecting statues. The column, which has also been in the news recently as whether or not this is a kind of colonialist, European, anti-indigenous monument, which has been, you know, presented by some people, of course, was put up by Italian Americans. And what's interesting about it is that that was all raised by new immigrants to the United States. If you go read, who's read the inscriptions on it? I gotcha. Ah, finally. Okay, sorry, this was I feel like this is my Matt moment because I was looking at the inscriptions and I don't have the detailed one. They're in Italian and in English. And I think that's very striking because it's talking to two different populations, but also that the Italian Americans were able to raise the money through popular subscription, the same model that was used for the Statue of Liberty, reminds us that this isn't just, these aren't always erected by the people who in theory have all the authority and status and control. And actually they did much better erecting this, and this was up for the parades. Next is, you can see the temporary arch. There's a temporary arch that was erected at 59th and 5th Avenue. And this one never got built because they couldn't raise the money for it. So I think that's also, even though people who were much more established, and now I can't remember who all the architects were. The architect was a guy named Heintz, who was at Columbia. But other people involved in supporting it, who are kind of the vanguard and the old guard of New York, couldn't raise the money for it. So I think that's always this interesting moment because it allows us to rethink what we know and the narratives that surround these monuments. So if we look a little bit deeper, we may in fact find different stories about different New Yorkers in them that we wouldn't necessarily expect. And so that's one of the reasons why this idea of layering or stratigraphy, of building on top of it, if we can use that to force ourselves as viewers walking around New York City, we can look a little bit more closely at these buildings and perhaps and these monuments as well, and they may surprise us. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the things that I think you should all do, although it sounds like you guys are often walking and looking at lots of things and you're not on your iPhones, which is great. But these are a big thing. And then we have, I guess the last thing to say is that there were two more that were temporary. The Dewey Arch. So America has kind of arrived as being an empire. So there was a huge arch erected to Dewey to celebrate the Spanish-American War. And then the World War I arch, which was erected to celebrate returning soldiers and veterans. Although neither of those were made into permanent monuments for a number of reasons.
Let's hold the imperialism thought for 1 second. And I just want to have an aside to talk about a master of spectacle who was incorporating a lot of this imagery into his work, which was P.T. Barnum, who makes an appearance in your book. And you have some amazing imagery of circus posters where that actually includes some of the arches, and I think there's one that even includes the Apollo Belvedere statue. So he was tapping into that interest and enthusiasm. But Matt, I wanted to talk to you about the distinction between Roman style and the connotations associated with it and the Greek style. Maybe we can talk about what's going on at Washington Square Park, for example, with the arch and the houses. I don't know if those are visible behind.
I've got the arch, but I think we're looking the wrong way. We're looking south, but. Yeah,
but I'm sure many of you know in this audience that to the north and east, that is on the facing side of that block, which is Washington Square North, is perhaps the finest example in New York of the so-called Greek Revival style, a row of handsome houses from the earlier part of the 19th century that are in fact in dialogue with this building, which is prototypically Roman, And you see this in so many places throughout the city in architectural form, but also in language. And so I have discovered in particular in many of the courts down in what's
Foley
the area?
Square.
In Foley Square, that there is a kind of equal representation of Latin and Greek. It seems that the Greeks have a purchase on, you might say, rights, things that we associate generally with democracy. So Greece was, I think, an important idea, especially in the formative years of this country's history. As the country became more established, Rome, for perhaps obvious reasons, became a more appealing model, even an imperial model. And for matters of justice, I think the Roman model seems to lend itself there in that area. But that's a great place to collect inscriptions. And also to see classical quotation in architectural form at work.
And there was another way that Greek and Roman culture was being disseminated to a general public, which was the Metropolitan Museum. And you have a great piece in your collection by Elizabeth Macaulay-Lewis talking about how the genesis of that collection and how it was effectively shaped by the preferences and personalities of the curators in charge, which I thought was a really interesting backstory. So I don't know if one of you wants to say a couple of words about that piece.
Sure.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of the examples that we were talking about from this period in the 1890s and early 20th century, many of them do have this Roman language that we've been seeing. But what was so interesting in the collecting of art, of ancient art, was this huge preference for Greek art, which kind of starts with Johann Winckelmann, who writes his kind of history of Greek antiquities in the mid-18th century, and this becomes the foundational kind of text for art history. And he is all about Greek things. Greek art, Greek sculpture, Greeks. For somebody who did Roman stuff for their entire dissertation, I was a little annoyed with him quite often. But his preference and power has really lasted into the 21st century, but it's very evident with the collecting that was done in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So I don't know, if you guys go up to the second floor, you'll see the Cesnola collection. That was the original collection of antiquities that Luigi Palma de Cesnola, who was the first director of the Met, had bought. He bought it all from Cyprus, and it kind of brought it back. He excavated it, and what happened was, kind of once the museum got started, the trustees were like, well, this isn't really Greek art. It's not the canonical Greek 5th century beautiful classical stuff. We need to have the canonical beautiful Greek stuff because that's the best art. And if you're going to have a universal museum, you can't be missing this kind of core foundational collection to do that. And so Liz Bartman's chapter really looks at how this question of aesthetics drives the collecting rather than doing, say, excavations. One of the points that she brings up, which is very amusing, which is very true if you're an archaeologist, is when you excavate, you never get what you want. You kind of get what you get, and you shouldn't get upset. I mean, I say that to my kids, you get what you get and you don't get upset. But if you're a collector and you're a museum, you really want to have the right stuff. You don't want duplicates. You want things in pristine condition. And so that meant that the priorities of the museum were in a sense very different than the architecture surrounding it, because the original display space for most of the collection, once there was an actual home, which really got going there, the kind of, I guess this is Wing K, which is the court that's the Leon Levy and Shelby White court today. That was originally designed as a Pompeian garden. And Liz has some great pictures of this, but this idea that, of course, Greek art should be shown in a Roman garden, which actually a lot of Greek art was kind of interesting. But again, it's this kind of architectural frame for the beautiful, glorious Greek. So it speaks to some of the complexities that again, we've liked this idea of layering, but also multiple conversations. It's not just Greek at one period, Roman at another period, Egyptian, boom, 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 boom. It's this kind of whole mixing, because one of the things as a young nation and then a nation with an empire was it was trying to articulate, in a sense, who we were. And pasts which had authority were things that you could kind of cherry pick and use in your own way, which made them really appealing.
Well, we're on borrowed time, but before we open it up to audience questions, I just wanted to take a moment to talk about another subject that comes up, and I think is such a direct connection between the classical world and specifically the Roman world and the city. Then you have two great papers on baths. And so, the idea of the bath as a public space and in some ways a equalizing kind of space, but a nuanced space as well, and in good New York club style. There's in talking about some of the baths that were early 20th century. There were private rooms, the Diocletian Club within a bath, and I wondered if one of you just wanted to say a few words about the idea of the bath as a cultural locale.
Yeah. Well, there are two pieces in the book about the baths, and rightfully so, because famously, the old Penn Station was modeled on the baths of Caracalla at Rome, and McKim actually had his workers walk through the space of the baths of Caracalla in order to get a sense of scale for Penn Station. And so in terms of the form, the baths, Roman baths, the high imperial baths, the baths of Caracalla, Diocletian, provide an important model. But there's another way in which bathing and bath culture is an important moment or series of moments in the city's history, in particular for the immigrant population. And we have a article in the book which explores the phenomenon of bathing, the phenomenology of the experience of bathing from the early 19th century until, in fact, the late 20th century. So the different cultures that were served by the baths. And so there are different perspectives, not merely architectural, but indeed phenomenological and social historical that we look at bathing.
Yeah, and with regard to the Baths of Diocletian, you also make the interesting point that there are fragments of that building still standing that you could go see in Rome now, whereas Penn Station is completely gone. So on that rather sad note, let's open it up to audience questions. And if you would like to raise your hand, and I'll help field questions. Yes, back here.
So certain buildings, like genres of buildings, often museums, train stations, are classically influenced. But I also noticed that baths are. And you can be in a very poor neighborhood and then this classical building, the old dime savings or something, just sitting there. So was there some kind of logic to what kind of buildings would have classical influence?
Yeah, good question.
Yeah.
Sure, there does seem to be a logic. Oops, sorry, this is going differently. Yes, there does. So kind of to answer the questions about kind of financial or banks, to start with, one of the first most impressive buildings that was built outside of Washington, D.C. was the U.S. Customs House, better known to us today as Federal Hall, which is in the book. And this, of course, was where the U.S. got a huge percentage of the federal government got its tax revenue. So I think that sets a certain tone. But there's also this idea of the kind of strength of a temple as an architectural form. And so you're going to build your big solid bank that is made of limestone, and it's a testament to how secure your bank is. And even the Bankers Trust Building, which is literally right across from Federal Hall, it ends up being used on all the letterhead. This is built in like 1912, 19-teens. To emphasize how secure it was. So I think we see it in bank architecture, financial architecture, Civic architecture, again, alluding to the classical past. Museums, institutions, but we do also end up seeing it in places we might not expect it. So, for example, there were restaurants in the late 19th century called lobster palaces, which are fabulous. There's just, everyone should read about lobster palaces because they were all about lobsters and champagne. These were places that you would go, that the kind of new, rich, fast crowd would go, generally with your mistress, not your wife. Stanford White, of course, was found in many of these. But many of them also used the decor of antiquity because there was this idea of luxury. So one of the things that you get initially with like the early part of the 19th century is that Rome is bad. Rome is an empire, Rome declines, fall and decline, everybody's read Gibbon, don't do Roman stuff. But by the late 19th century, America's got an empire, America's coming up, ooh, you know, let's have some fun, and we're imperial. I mean, that's a gross simplification, but at least in some of these lobster palaces, one of them was called Murray's Roman Gardens. And it is designed like this insane, over-the-top interior where you have like garlands, lighting, caryatid porches, columns, fountains, because this was the idea of luxury. And there's a whole, there are publicity documents with this building that basically say, we are trying to imitate the Rome of Nero because that was when it was most luxurious. And there's even a discussion of the Great Fire of Rome where he goes, well, that's okay, because he was able to rebuild Rome and it was so much nicer, which is actually like the line Nero, you know, is attributed to Nero when you sit there and go, he's an absolute megalomaniac nut job. How can you condone this? But that's then twisted to be a positive thing in like 1910. So I think we can see what's interesting about it is there are these canonical references that we get in banks, in museums, in cultural institutions, don't forget libraries and universities, but then there are also these interesting other ways in which the past is taken in different directions that we might not expect it. And I think that's where we find some really interesting kind of conversations.
Great. Yes, question?
My question is about the New York City subway system, which is one of the largest pieces of construction we have that kind of follows your time frame. It started as 5 separate railroads that is now one transportation system. Have you looked at the New York City subways for indications of classical Rome or Greece in the columns and mosaics that unfortunately are being covered up by renovations and construction? Have you taken a look at that before most of it disappears? And the new world will not know how beautiful some of our subway stations were originally when they were constructed. Do you have any thoughts or feelings about it?
Yes, if I may. Such a great question. And I would simply say, and let me answer personally here, that that has been on my radar screen for some time now. But I would say we haven't done anything in any systematic way. But you know, who knows, volume 2, or if we ever get to tackle that. There are so many hidden places for the discovery of classical antiquity, and indeed we have discovering in our title, but one thinks of not merely the subway itself, but the names of subway stations and the avenues, you know, Nereid Avenue, you've got, oh, just so many. I don't even know where else to go with that. But there are lots of classic, sort of hidden classical quotations. There, in the case of the subway, they're sort of hidden in plain sight, and it just takes somebody to look at them in some systematic fashion, which is a great suggestion.
Well, and I think the other thing is that, you know, mosaics are often deployed. Mosaics have their own kind of life and history. The only example I can think of where there's something overtly classical, I think, is at Grand Army Plaza, where there are flying winged victories in mosaic form to kind of almost announce you're about to get out and you're going to see this monument that should remind you of the Civil War, and that you would see similar motifs when you would go and look in the spandrels. So that was a clear reference. But the idea, I think, of the subway stations as having references to the buildings, like if you go to the American Museum of Natural History, there are animals everywhere, and now in the news stations on the 2nd Avenue subway, there are like happy people with balloons.
Yeah.
So I think there is more to be done. I feel like there is a book about mosaics in the subway, but I don't remember what the title of it is.
Yeah.
But I feel like there is one of those books that exists.
Yeah.
There is, yeah. But I think it's the type of thing we could do more. There are also other kind of architectural moments that are in the city. Like I'm actually going to think, I see Gail's in the back. This is in Gail's territory. There is a pavilion up by 155th Street. Am I right, Gail? Sorry, that's white. But there are these pavilions. There's also one right by Grant's tomb that were kind of lookout pavilions, and they're designed with Doric columns, and they're very elegant. But they're again these forgotten kind of little moments that aren't grand, they aren't huge. And if we can do as much as we can do to kind of track them and note them, that's what we want to do. So it's a good question and something we need to do more on.
Here, question?
This was great. I noticed a lot of the buildings had Guastavino ceilings. Was he to go to that for Greco-Roman?
When it comes to tiles and vaults, they really are. They just turn up everywhere. You kind of can't go wrong. Yeah, I mean, yeah, they're just, yeah, I mean, you kind of,
Right, City Hall has it.
Yeah.
everybody has it. I mean, and it's one of those things that it's just kind of, as you go through stuff, it's like a no-brainer. There's never a discussion. It's who you go to. Yeah.
I think there's a question, another question over here.
No, well, just to your last comment about these moments that are kind of hidden around the city, tucked away, or either plain sight or tucked away. There's a mini triumphal arch, if you want to call it, that's hidden behind a car parts establishment of Inwood.
Yeah, it's the Seaman Estate. Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
I mean, it's really small, and if you don't
Yeah.
know what you're looking for, because it's really been compromised.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that's
Good to know.
And that also speaks to one of the other important things that kind of appears throughout are these historical photos, because there's no way we will ever manage to document or know everything. But what we found was so helpful when you have these photos or historical building plans, a lot that were done during the Depression, that there are these actually huge troves of documents that we can also start to go through to find buildings that are, partially compromised or that no longer exist. And so that's a great example as well. Yeah.
Thank you. This is very interesting. Does this also spread out to the smaller communities, the satellite communities around Gotham, like Westchester, Long Island, Jersey? Do they have little downtowns with the inscriptions, the use of language, and the styles of buildings in their downtown?
I can speak a little bit to that. I don't know if you get the same level of kind of complexes that are built, but they're present in so many places. If you go to cemeteries, you will find obelisks everywhere. So there are certain things that are easy to track, but if you were, you think of going to, I can think of going up towards New England because that's where I grew up, but the number of Greek revival churches, they're all over. So it's definitely a phenomenon that you can see all up and down the East Coast of the United States. But it may not be, part of it is a question of affluence in communities, so it may be that there are smaller numbers of monuments, but they're pretty well attested, I would say.
Here.
You just mentioned obelisks. Was the whole Egyptian thing a fad? Why did that disappear and get gobbled up by all the Greek reservoir?
Okay, so Egypt goes in waves a little bit. Part of it was at that time, well, first of all, like the description of Egypt had been published, and so this was this huge undertaking by Napoleon, which while invading Egypt, he brought all these scientists and naturalists, kind of a la Alexander the Great. I'm gonna go conquer the world and educate everybody about it. But it was a huge way that most people in Europe and the United States got to know about these monuments. And so a lot of people were building structures like that at the time, and it was seen to be as lasting forever, entirely monumental, and technologically advanced. That was the other thing. So there's this kind of technological reference that people really embraced. And so at that point, it was very popular what seems to happen as you go through the 19th century is that the funereal overtones, which are there from the beginning, which you see in Woodlawn Cemetery from quite early on, but also in Mount Auburn in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and also in Laurel Hill in Philadelphia, those start to become the dominant ones. So if you go to Greenwood and you go to Woodlawn, not only will you find obelisks, you will find pyramids. There are pyramids in Greenwood, none in Woodlawn that I know about. And in Woodlawn, you will find monuments that allude to the bark kiosk of Trajan on the island of Philae and the Temple of Dendor. And so what seems to go are a bit of waves, but this funereal emphasis comes up stronger. And then when Cleopatra's Needle comes here, then there's a spike again. And what's interesting, there's an obelisk in Woodlawn Cemetery that actually has the crabs underneath it supporting the obelisk, so it's clear that they had seen the Cleopatra's Needle, had the actual crabs that had been used by Augustus when the obelisk had been resupported, and had done that in the tomb. None of the other obelisks I've ever seen in Woodlawn or Greenwood have that, so this to me was perfect example. And then there's another big interest after the findings of Howard Carter. So it seems to be, Egypt is like one of those things that people always love, but they have to be reminded of just how cool it is, and then it resurges. Sorry, a long answer.
That's great. Yes.
A question. Can you explain the term Beaux-Arts and the connection to the classical architecture? And also, are there neighborhoods, aside from these great icons, are there neighborhoods with streetscapes that you think provide great examples of just kind of everyday classical architecture incorporated into dwellings?
Sure. I mean, you can talk about your favorite buildings too, if you want to. Should we do Beaux-Arts first?
Do the Beaux-Arts.
Okay. The Beaux-Arts basically started, in a sense, the good arts. It started in France, and it's the École des Beaux-Arts, and this idea that there should be kind of proper training for artists and architects, and that the classical world was the place that you looked for this architecture. And so it's well established in France. What starts to happen in the second half of the 19th century is that Americans go and train there as well. So Charles McKim was one of those individuals who went and trained, but there's like a whole, I mean, everybody's been in Paris, effectively. And so that is kind of where we get the training. But the point always to make is that there are people engaging with classical architecture long before there are Americans studying there, largely through publications like the Description of Egypt or the Antiquities of Athens or the like American Builder's Companion, which have these detailed drawings of classical and Egyptian antiquities. Now, in terms of places you can go walk, I feel like you should say some of the places you like to go walk.
Yeah. Well, on Staten Island, there's Sailor's Snug Harbor, which remains, I think, the finest example of the Greek Revival style in the country. And that's a whole community. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's now joined with the Staten Island Botanical Garden, and it's a beautiful complex for walking. But it was, at the time, in the early 19th century, an important place for sailors when the harbor of New York and Staten Island in particular was used by sailors. So that's an excellent example of a fully integral attempt at bringing Greek architectural style to a kind of discrete community. But there are so many places to walk. I mean, Lizzie mentioned the cemeteries, and the cemeteries are sites of endless fascination for many reasons, and partly even the monuments. But for finding, I don't know if we're on to finding quotations, but there are just lots of churches in the city tend to be a good spot if you're looking for Latin, Catholic churches in particular. But that's perhaps another conversation.
I mean, in certain ways, you also can't go wrong by just walking around Lower Manhattan because of the way the city was. But in Lower Manhattan, if you're going to do it, you have to have the two conversations. You have to be looking down at eye level. So you can be at St. Paul's and you can see the Montgomery Memorial, which is the first memorial in the United States history, which has a huge Latin inscription, which is in Matt's chapter. And then if you look up, you can start to see the whole conversation of the skyscrapers with what's on top. And you'll see everything from, the mausoleum of Halicarnassus, which actually turns up quite a lot, to various, I know, it's like why there are step pyramids on the tops of buildings. Or if you look at the top of the Manhattan Municipal Building and you have kind of, another, female figure floating around. So it's these interesting conversations you can have, but you have to look up and look down. So, yeah.
As far as the inscriptions, are there any kind of themes that thread through the inscriptions around the city, or are they more specific to the type of building that is served?
Well, I would say a combination of both. They're certainly particular to the building. So the example of the New York Academy of Medicine is a good one, where the quotations are thematically linked by their association with medicine and the history of medicine. In religious buildings, you'll often find scripture quoted. But I think of the actual form of so many Latin quotations on our monuments as deriving, in fact, from the column of Trajan and the letter forms used there in the early 2nd century AD in Rome. That just the sheer way in which the letters are carved into the stone suggests a kind of monumentality associated with imperial Rome. And you find that, for example, in English inscriptions on monumental buildings. Indeed, Lizzie's first example of the American Museum of Natural History, those are Trajanic letters, essentially, for an English inscription. So that's an interesting connection, just the sheer, they're linked formally.
Well, the New York Academy of Medicine example was such an interesting one, and I was wondering if there are any other examples of mistakes or perhaps like nonsense inscriptions that people, just thought it was the thing to do to include Greek or Latin. I'm sure, Lizzie, you've run across pseudo-Kufic in your work, and this idea of sort of taking a language or text that's and apply it in a more visual way, in a way that doesn't actually mean anything.
Well, an example that isn't classical, while Matt's looking for this one, is Olana up at Frederick Church's house, because he has an Ajami house, and that his an Ajami room, and it's just all fake. It's gibberty-gibberish. It doesn't mean anything in the Arabic, but it's really pretty.
It looks good. Yeah.
So on that note, things that look pretty.
Yeah, this inscription is from the tomb of Bertram Grosvenor Goodhue, who was the primary ecclesiastical architect working in the city in the late 19th, early 20th century. Very famous for his medieval style churches, had a firm with Cram, Goodhue and Cram, and some of you may know their work throughout the city. This is the Church of the Intercession on 155th and Broadway, across from Trinity Cemetery, which was considered by Goodhue his crowning achievement, and there he is indeed buried, and his lifelong partner, I just mean artistic partner, Lee Lowry, sculpted his tomb. And Goodhue and Lowry came from a common stock and did not have the education that so many of their patrons had. And to read the letter of Goodhue is to see someone who felt keenly his lack of college education, even though artistically he had achieved virtually anyone in the country, to be sure. Lowry, the same thing. Lowry, I don't even know if he went to school, the grammar school, let alone college, but he showed his stuff early on to Goodhue and was taken under his wing, and naturally, after some 40 years of working together, constructed the funerary monument of Goodhue. But he got the Latin inscription wrong. And we don't care at all. We certainly do not judge. But this beautiful inscription, which is taken, in fact, from Johnson's inscription written in honor of Oliver Goldsmith in London. Nil teti git, it should be. He touched nothing which he did not make beautiful, which he did not adorn, was Lee Lawrie's tribute to his great friend and co-worker. And it shows, you can see all the great works of Goodhue. There's the Yale Library there. There's the chapel at West Point. There's various churches throughout New York. He did the public library in Los Angeles. He did the State House in Kansas, in Lawrence. So in any case, that's an example.
Excellent, thank you. So we need to wrap up, but first I wanted to note that I have heard that you get your class to sing carols in Latin during the holidays. Is that true?
This is true. Yes. And we are having our annual Saturnalia in the Bronx, right? It's a Catholic school, but we can't celebrate Christmas. So we do them one better. We don't have a holiday party. My students say, oh, I want to come to the holiday party. I say, no holiday party. We have a Saturnalia, and we sing in Latin. And so that's at 4 o'clock on Friday in the Bronx.
Oh, there you go. And on that note, please join me in thanking Lizzie and Matt for their great book and contributions. And thank everybody for coming out this evening. It was great to have you here. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. It was fun. Yeah, good, yeah. It was fun.
Do you have regular talks like this?
Well,